This week we were all briny, happy people.
No, Pamela's Pickles.
As Pamela, has Pickles and Jam, and I do want to get to the movie, has Pickles and Jam been a big part of your life, or did this sort of come along later?
Oh, no, my aunt won all the pickles and mustard awards, actually, on Vancouver Island. So I come from a long line of picklers.
You and Harold, is it a love of pickles?
Yes.
Okay.
Pamela Anderson on Late Night with Seth Meyers back in January of this year. So, Jamie, what's the story this week?
Pamela Anderson's Pickles. It was quite amusing there that she said she came from a long line of pickles, which threw up some interesting imagery there from your Baywatch days. She's launched a limited edition line of her spicy pickles this week, currently priced at, I'm going to give you a guess, do you think it's more or less than $30 a jar, Arion? Actually, everyone can jump in.
I mean, it has to be... The reason you're asking is that it's going to be more, but it should be less, right?
It's $38 a jar.
Correct.
Isn't that wild? I'm not just following the ins and outs of Pamela Anderson's life here. I'm bringing it to the table because it is a good example of how pickles are everywhere. I don't know if you've noticed, but they are the food trend of the year. Just to bring it back to the UK, 16% year-on-year increase from Ocado for pickle sales. Searches for pickles on Waitrose website have gone up 123% in the last year. Tesco have said that they needed to increase the range of pickles and fermented foods it stocks by 2/3 in the past year. We have gone absolutely pickling mad.
Okay, quick point of order here. You can pickle pretty much anything. Are we talking about all pickle kind, or are we talking about just kind of gherkins?
I think we're talking about what my granddad used to call wallies in Cockney lingo, which is a pickled gherkin. And you could get it from fish and chip shops. And he would always ask me to pick up a wally. Well, he wouldn't ask me because I was 10 years old or whatever. My mum would pick up a wally for him at the fish and chip shop. So I believe we are talking about pickled gherkins in general. But obviously, there has actually been since... I think really since COVID, there's been a kind of fascination with fermentation and fermented things. That's been another big food trend. Obviously, fermentation has been going on for thousands and thousands of years. I wasn't claiming that it just started in 2020.
Well, your grandfather was obviously ahead of his time, but pickles, it strikes me, Felicity, they're not like kale or quinoa or like chia seeds or these foodstuffs that seem to arrive in our consciousness all of a sudden. Pickles have been around, as Jamie was just saying, forever. Why is everyone suddenly eating loads of them?
I think a number of things can explain this. I mean, there has been a lot of influence from Korea recently. I mean, we did a podcast a while ago about how cool Korea is, all Korean culture. And they're big into their pickles and their fermentation and all that sort of thing. So I think, foods like kimchi and, other pickled goodies have become very, very popular. And the same with Scandinavia, where pickling is also has been a tradition, for forever, really. And I think Scandinavian cuisine became very, very cool. I think there's also just something fun about pickles, right? Like it just lends itself to loads of memes. It's slightly phallic. They're just a bit silly and a bit naughty. And the number of toddlers I see walking around with Mama's Little Pickle emblazoned on their t-shirt. So I think pickles are just sort of fun, basically. But I do think it's ironic because, when we talk about the price of how much Pamela Anderson is selling them for, that they've sort of become this like luxury product that, a lot of ordinary people wouldn't be able to afford. But it is going back to something ancestral, the idea of surviving, very harsh winters, that you'd have to pickle and preserve and salt everything in the spring or the summer months in order to get you through the winter. It's sort of it's growing and storing food for necessity rather than luxury. So I think that's really ironic in a way that that's now becoming this very expensive luxury product that it was never supposed to be.
Yeah, well, okay, so Felicity's thrown up a few theories about the history of pickles, about their cuteness and the phallic quality. I mean, one of the other things I heard floated was that it's kind of a health-related thing, Julia. Is there a health benefit to eating pickled foods and specifically wallies?
I think This is an excellent story for the week Unwrapped. I actually think Felicity and Jamie, all of our topics have been really interesting, but I have to pay tribute to Jamie because I love a story that on the one hand purports to be about a simple subject, but actually on further inspection, it can also tell a much deeper story about society and where we are at the moment. And I think what is so interesting about this pickle, particularly what Felicity says about, this is something that goes back many, many years, and there is a sort of historic traditional sort of aspect about this. First of all, in some of the articles that have been looking at the pickle trend and, talking to, culinary trend experts, all cited that a lot of this is being driven by Gen Z. I still say Gen Z, not Gen Z. Gen Z craze and their appetite for not just big flavors, but also the health conscious benefits of it, the fermentation, but also the fact that you can also have a personality cult about this. And so many trends and so many things that we see on Instagram that become our next big craze, whether it's Labubu dolls or whether it's matcha or whether it's pickles or whether it's whatever, I think something bigger is happening, which is that social media is increasingly driving our discovery of everything. We are now sort of force-fed new trends on a conveyor belt of our algorithms rather than coming across them in the daily course of our lives. We're at sort of peak convenience era. We sort of lay back and have everything delivered to us. And one thing that I think is very interesting, an impact of all of this, there was a story on the BBC this week that was about how AI is potentially starting to impact doctors' skills. And it found that those who used AI-assisted programs to spot cancerous growths were less effective to spot these without them. And the question was, is AI potentially damaging the very skills that they're built to ostensibly support? Now, bear with me, this is relevant because I think what we are seeing with this renewed interest in these sort of old-fashioned things like, the long art of pickling, is that many people are increasingly, subconsciously perhaps, rejecting this and moving towards some of these old traditional practices and pastimes. We're seeing like the rise of homesteading, even natalism, the growth of slow hobbies like gardening and traditional crafts, things you cannot look up on Amazon, click and have delivered by a drone in the next few hours. I think all of this in some way is representing a backlash against our new technological age. There is no way to fast track a pickle. You have to go through the process, which, to be fair, is probably why Pamela Anderson thinks she can charge nearly $40, because pickling takes time. There is no technological shortcut to that as of yet. And I think it's so interesting because everywhere you look, you are seeing people slowly rejecting so much of our modern lifestyles and trying to move back into slower and perhaps environmentally smaller ways of life.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so Jamie, Julia has raised a whole new
I
can
thought,
of pickles
you know what?
there.
I just thought it was because Wally's looked a bit like Willy's. That was
right.
That was the thing I thought the people were interested in. But
according to her analysis, it's not as simple as pickles are supposedly good for hangovers, which is one of the other hypotheses that's being promoted on social media. What do you think of that? Do you think this is something about people's return to the old ways, the better ways?
I think I had another theory that's quite linked to that, but I was going to get on my soapbox about, which was more about food trends and things like that. But it's certainly a very appealing suggestion. And I think when I was referencing COVID, that was kind of what I was suggesting, was that a lot, and people know that from anecdotes from everyone that I knew, that when lockdown happened, suddenly people got into baking. They started growing things on their windowsills. They were going back to kind of traditional or slightly more esoteric pursuits, while at the same time also spending a lot of time on their phones and showing people the very esoteric things that they were doing while on lockdown. And everyone was living in this very intense bubble that kind of, it seemed a way of getting peace, I guess. So I do agree with what Julia was saying. I think the other thing is a little bit about this, is this kind of chase constantly with food trends to get something a little bit a slightly more interesting take, or a little bit more spicy, or a little bit more a kind of constant optimization that I think probably exists across culture now in every realm of like, oh, we can just tweak this recipe, or we can just tweak this addition, this thing that you're doing, because everyone wants to achieve this peak goal. Everyone is straining for this idea of, enlightenment through, be it the best version of a matcha latte that they can get, be it the best pickle that they can create. It's quite scary in some respects that, this hyper optimization that we're the world that we're living in. Equally, I think there's something, as Felicity said, there is something quite fun about pickles, and in a way maybe we shouldn't be. It's not that deep, as young people would say.
Julia, are you into fad foods? Have you ever waited in line for a cronut or a cupcake or a TikTok famous sandwich?
I'm probably not the best person to ask this question because I grew up in Indonesia and Singapore, and so my palate is quite complicated because from a very young age it was very, very dominated by very, very strong flavors. And I think part of the food fads, particularly you see it a lot in the West, are because of the rise of globalization and the opening up of whole different food markets and global culinary experiences. A lot of these trends, with the exception of pickles, to be fair, which does have its roots, in the colder climates up in Europe, but things like matcha, things, like ramen, all these sort of food crazes are often sort of global food crazes. And what is also interesting, which was a question which was posed in a New York Times article, opinion piece about why everyone is eating pickles now, asked the question about hyper flavor, and are we in an era of hyper flavor, which I thought was so interesting because we are sort of peak Technicolor age, aren't we? And you only just have to look at, for example, not just food adverts, which are so sort of painfully vibrant that they give you a headache by looking at them. But, following on from our conversation about nostalgia and harking back to old practices, I saw an advert on Instagram the other day of the old original Disney movies. And what was so immediately apparent was that compared to today's modern movies, the palette is quite muted. And, you just put on Peppa Pig and it's like, whoa, hyperstimulation. And which is something that studies that people are starting to look at now. This era of sensory overload and the fact that we are now sort of trained to require complexity and even more intense flavors, even more umami, even more bite. And, in some ways you're seeing a rejection of that by going back to a simple sort of one-dimensional flavor, which is the sharp, acidic bite of a pickle, which only has, two ingredients, the vegetable, the water, and the salt.